really take the specific book that they were teaching and plug it into the bigger picture of the whole nations. And as a result of that, I always felt like I was getting an incomplete picture of what was happening. And I was getting bits and pieces, but I wasn't seeing how this specific book, let's say Hosea, is fitting into the broader picture of Israel. And so that is a big deal, and we really don't want to miss that. So that's the historical situation. And then you want to consider as well in interpretation the literary forms. And the literary forms in the prophets are very important. And the reason for that is the prophets all write poetry. When you think of prophecy, you need to immediately think about poetry, which means that you want to kind of review your understanding of Hebrew poetry, the parallelism, the figures of speech, the incredible power and drama that are in some of these poems that these people write, that at times they are writing poetry in order to have an impact. And we just can't overemphasize this in the writing of the prophets. Now, as well, you find various forms of literature used by the prophets. You find symbols, and you find oracles, and you find enacted symbols. Enacted symbols are just an amazing part of the prophets when you consider even Hosea, where God tells Hosea to go marry a harlot. I mean, my gracious, it doesn't get any more dramatic than that. Or in the book of Ezekiel, where God tells Ezekiel to go knock a hole in the side of his house and shove his suitcase through the wall, and for him to go out through that wall. That's a very powerful, dramatic, enacted symbol, and God is using that to communicate something to his people in Judah. So we don't want to miss the power of these symbols. One of the things I do want to talk to you about that are very important are the oracles, because oracles are a way that God speaks through the prophets to help them reflect back on the law of Moses. And Douglas Stewart, in his book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, talks about 3 different kinds of oracles that we find in the prophets. And all 3 of these oracles are very important for understanding the whole of the genre of literature of prophecy. The first one is the lawsuit oracle. And what we have is God is portrayed as the plaintiff. He's the one who has the complaint. He's also the prosecuting attorney, and he is the judge. Now, this is bad news for Israel and for Judah. Because when you've got the plaintiff and the attorney and the judge, and it's all the same person, and he never makes a mistake, you have a real problem here. And so God has a lawsuit with his people. And you find generally the way the lawsuit oracles work is the first thing God calls for are witnesses to the suit. And what that means is he's calling people, or he's calling things, sometimes inanimate objects, to come and witness the day in court that God's going to bring on his people. For instance, one place in Isaiah, God says, give ear, O heavens and the earth. Well, those are the witnesses to the lawsuit. And so God says, I want all of you to come listen to this. And then you find in the lawsuit is that the charge is made. So in other words, God then brings a charge against his people. He says, you've done this and this and this. And so you have the charge, and then you have the evidence that's brought, and he brings very specific instances where they did things, and finally there's the verdict, which invariably, when they're in sin, is against them. So that's a very important oracle, and you'll find this over and over in the prophets, and you don't want to miss it, that God has a lawsuit with his people. And he really has a controversy with Israel. You find in, for instance, Isaiah chapter 3, that God has a controversy. He has a lawsuit with his people, and he's bringing it. The second one is an oracle of woe. And these oracles of woe can be actually connected to the lawsuit oracle, because if the people are found guilty, then of course God can bring doom on the nation. And you find these woe oracles, for instance, in Isaiah chapter 5, where God is comparing his people to a vineyard, and they've just gone completely terrible, and God utters all of these woes against his people because of their waywardness. And so you have the second kind of an oracle, which is kind of a woe oracle. The interesting thing is we can get kind of overcome by the negativity of the prophets, and we don't want to miss the third kind of an oracle, which is known as a salvation oracle. And these oracles generally are talking about 2 things, and that is that God is going to restore his people. Once he's disciplined them and, shall we say, spanked them properly, he's going to bring them back to the land, and he's going to fulfill some of the promises of grace that he gave them there at the end of Leviticus 26, for instance. But the other thing about salvation oracles are that God says he's going to send the Messiah. And there will be a deliverer that comes for the people who's going to take their sins. And there are just some really wonderful salvation oracles through the prophets that you don't want to miss. Isaiah 52 and 53. These are wonderful oracles of salvation. As well, you find in the prophets, you find laments where the prophet will just weep over the state of the nation. You find the whole book of Lamentations basically to be a long and extended lament. And as you consider that, then you see that one of the things, again, it's almost like an enacted symbol, that the prophet Jeremiah actually acts out God's heart, which is just filled with lamentation and grieving for his people. And so you have that picture. The other thing, as far as the way the prophets communicate in literary form, one other thing I do want to highlight is this idea of visions. And sometimes the way the prophet will write in visions are not systematic, and sometimes they seem rather overdone. Sometimes you think the prophet may be taking a bit of literary license, but he's not. He's simply, remember what I said from the first session, he's simply describing what he saw. For instance, in Ezekiel chapter 1, you have this bizarre vision that Ezekiel has, and this is what prophets do, and there is a message in that God himself is coming to visit his people, and that is both good and bad news for the people. So as we think about some basic guidelines for interpreting the prophets, let me give you a few thoughts as we close. First one is this: you want to remember the historical and the literary circumstance. You really want to consider both of these things. You want to consider the context that prophet finds himself in relative to the whole history of the nation. What is the context of that particular prophet? We want to consider the intent of the prophet. Is he writing to encourage? Is he writing to rebuke? Maybe he's writing to do both things simultaneously. One of the other things I think we want to consider in interpreting these prophets is, because it is poetry, we want to be careful about over-interpretation. And that is to take every little detail and say, well, this means this and that means that. Not necessarily. Poetry is intended to create an impression in people. It's intended to stir up emotions. And a lot of times, what I have observed through the years in reading people's understanding of the prophets is they tend to over-interpret. And when you do that, you can come up with some rather strange interpretations. One of the other things we want to remember is everything in the prophet is not a prediction. Although the prophets predict a lot, everything is not a prediction. For instance, in Hosea, you have 197 verses in the book of Hosea. 111 out of those 197 verses are prediction. That's a lot. However, everything in Hosea is not predictive. And so as you're looking at the prophets, you always want to remember this may be predictive, but it may not be predictive. And so, again, it just goes back to over-interpreting. And so as we look at these Old Testament prophets, the other thing we want to do is to look through the eyes of the New Testament writers, which we're going to bring up in the next and the final session as well.